Hello and welcome back to the Fireside Lit Book Club, a quiet, candlelit corner of the internet where we read slowly, think deeply, and speak authentically about our experiences. I'm Lindsay, and I invite you to join me by the fire as we explore the soul of a book, the beauty it reveals, the questions it asks, and the ways it helps us understand life, identity, and meaning just a little more clearly. So before we launch into this episode, I owe you guys an explanation regarding where I've been and what I've been up to over the last few months. For those who were loyal listeners, I apologize for having dropped off the face of the earth. To be completely honest with you, I was feeling a little discouraged, having been at this for about 9 months, I think, at the time, and not really having grown all that much. And I've said before that I've really always enjoyed creating content for these episodes and recording, but it does tend to get a bit defeating when you're working on something you really love and you feel sometimes like you're talking to yourself. So that's me being brutally honest. But I just kind of let the discouragement of not having more of a community at this point get to me, and I took a break for a couple of months because of it. So I'm not entirely sure whether I'm back for good, as I have also been focusing on my creative writing more these days. But I did want to record this episode, as I'm sure I'll want to record others, because I'm passionate about this topic and about this author, and I have been really since the first time I learned about him. So I seem to always be drawn to Ralph Waldo Emerson in the summer. I felt a strong urge to reread him again over the last few weeks, but the first time I read his work was actually 6 summers back in the pandemic year of 2020, and I remember lying in the sun on a picnic blanket in my backyard on a June day, and I read pretty much all day. And looking back, I have such fond memories of that because that's a luxury really only youth can give you. As you grow older, you have more responsibilities and less time to devote to reading and other leisure activities, especially for hours on end. But I remember just being so taken with Emerson's words and ideas and connecting with them on a really deep level. And I strongly suspect that that's because he and I are kindred spirits of sorts. Pretty sure he and I are the same Enneagram type, if you know anything about that. It's pretty interesting stuff. And as someone who's always valued individuality, intuition, and spiritual depth, I just have a lot in common with this man. There's really no other way to say it. And when I think about, different time periods I would have loved to have witnessed or been a part of, I think of Emerson's time period and specifically the movement he founded, known as the American Transcendentalist movement. Transcendentalism was embraced by a small but devoted community, largely based in Concord, Massachusetts, and it borrowed many of its ideologies from the German Romantics, specifically the concept of the divine in nature, intuition over sensual reason, direct experience of God over organized religion, and individualism and self-reliance over the group. A few of the key players in this group who were inspired by Emerson's ideas included Margaret Fuller, Bronson Alcott, who was the father of Louisa May Alcott, author of Little Women, and of course, Henry David Thoreau. These and many others were sort of rebels against the establishment at the time and were outspoken activists for causes such as feminism and women's suffrage, abolition, education reform, and more. Above all, they valued and prioritized their own moral compass over external pressure and demands from society. I think this is probably what I love most about Transcendentalism. These were really good people who saw the world for what it could be as opposed to what it was. They valued the individual and the individual's wants and needs over maintaining appearances or betraying the self to conform to social standards that ultimately didn't fit who they were. And we're all different. To some people, this probably sounds pretty scandalous and rabble-rousing, but to someone like me who probably would have been a transcendentalist had I lived at that time, it just feels like common sense. It feels like the most natural way for a human to be and to live a happy, fulfilling life. So Emerson talks a lot about these ideas in his essays, which you can read in a variety of editions, from Penguin Classics with the Portable Emerson to the Library of America's Emerson's Essays and Lectures. I have both of these and I love them both. However, if you're going to spring for one, I would recommend the portable Emerson just because it's paperback and it's more compatible with marginalia if that's your speed. And it also includes more of Emerson's work than the Library of America edition. So we kick things off with one of Emerson's most famous essays entitled Nature. And in this essay, Emerson talks a lot about who we are in relation to everything else. There are the external things like music, art, science, mathematics, a person's profession, etc. And then there are the internal things, the things that make us uniquely who we are. And he posits that we become closest to our true nature when we are among nature. We are eternally linked to and part of creation, operating with a unique purpose, the way a sunrise does, or a sunset, or the moon, or the stars. So Emerson believes we were ultimately not created as part of society, but as part of nature. You might guess, along these same lines, that Emerson believed nature was sacred. Upon reading him, I was reminded a lot of what I understand of Native American practices. There is this reverence for the world that I really wish were more prevalent because everything truly is sacred and deserves our respect and care. We're here for such a short time, and while we're here, we feel invincible, like we're gods, but we are merely a part of everything else. And so it is important to treat the people and the world around us with due reverence. This essay, as you might imagine, was extremely influential, particularly to a young man who would become Emerson's protege of sorts. And of course, I'm talking about Henry David Thoreau, who famously said, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life." What Thoreau was really kind of referencing here were ideas he'd absorbed directly from Emerson, who suggested in his essays that nature is a far better reflection of who we are and what we were made for than the customs, conventions, and traditions of society. And this is still very much a mentality that we have today. We go hiking, camping, rock climbing, canoeing, basically pick an outdoor activity in an attempt to find peace, in an attempt to, sort of declutter our minds from the sludge of every day, dealing with all these things that overburden us and lead to burnout, anxiety, and depression. And what are we really looking for when we turn to nature to find peace? Ourselves, because Emerson believed that nothing could bring you peace but yourself. This is the bulk of the essay Self-Reliance, which became as big as nature, and for which Emerson is actually best known today. The whole argument behind self-reliance is that the vast majority of people do what they are told to do and think what they are told to think their whole lives. They don't venture beyond the world of expectation to really choose their own lives and live deliberately. Emerson writes, "Henceforward I am the truths. Be it known unto you that henceforward I obey no law less than the eternal law. I will have no covenants but proximities. I shall endeavor to nourish my parents, to support my family, to be the chaste husband of one wife, but these relations I must fill after a new and unprecedented way. I appeal from your customs. I must be myself. I cannot break myself any longer for you. If you can love me for what I am, we shall be the happier. If you cannot, I will seek to deserve that you should. I will not hide my tastes or aversions. I will so trust that what is deep is holy, that I will do strongly before the sun and moon whatever inly rejoices me and the heart appoints. If you are noble, I will love you. If you are not, I will not hurt you and myself by hypocritical attentions. If you are true, but not in the same truth with me, cleave to your companions. I will seek my own. I do this not selfishly, but humbly and truly. It is alike your interest and mine and all men's, however long we have dwelt in lies, to live in truth. You will soon love what is dictated by your nature as well as mine, and if we follow the truth, it will bring us out safe at last." There is so much here, but I don't really think I've read anything else that so much as scratches the surface of what Emerson is getting at. What I love is that he doesn't seem to reject anyone outright for living differently than he does. He doesn't discredit or devalue relationships of obligation. He doesn't begrudge anyone for not liking him if he and they just don't jibe. This doesn't seem to be a man who lives in bitterness or even really wants to stick it to the man. He's only interested in living life on his own terms and in being true to himself. And to this day, with all the progress we've made in accepting ourselves for who we are in the 21st century, there's still this massive part of most people today that is far too concerned with what other people think. And I won't go so far as to say we should never care. I think some amount of caring is probably healthy. Otherwise, you're essentially a sociopath. But I think we still give way too much of a say to others and how we live our lives. There comes a time where we all have to grow up. And we may be used to deferring to our elders or kind of merely handing over the reins and living on autopilot when it comes to major life choices and beliefs. But there comes a point when that is no longer healthy. It makes sense in the first half of life when we're young and we don't have the wisdom or foresight of our caregivers to, defer to them in a lot of cases. But I think a major part of becoming a mature, well-adjusted adult is being able to make decisions for ourselves and trusting that we're making them for the right reasons with the right intentions. And those decisions could be devastating to some of the people we love. And that's an unintended consequence. I think even Emerson even alludes to this. The goal is never to hurt anyone. But if that occurs in the process of becoming who you were meant to be and in staying true to yourself, then we have to be able to make peace with that. Because we can't live our lives for other people according to their expectations and preferences. I also want to touch on another of Emerson's famous essays entitled Oversoul, which actually came at a really opportune time for me. Of course, I read this essay many years ago, but I don't think I really connected with it the same way back then. And I guess that's why the recommendation is to reread our favorite authors and books many times throughout our lives, because no two versions of us will be the same, and we will ingest these works differently each time we come to them. So the Oversoul is very similar to nature in some ways, in that Emerson emphasizes that all living things are connected by a shared universal spirit and that God lives inside every person. And because we all share this same spirit, we are all equal and linked. And this is where, quite honestly, I think a lot of New Age spirituality comes from. When people talk about the universe in place of God, for instance, I think that mentality is one that is derived from this particular essay. And despite my Catholic background and my continued affinity for many of those traditions, I do think there's something really beautiful about this. Because even in more concrete, structured religion, I would have to believe that most people feel that God is bigger than, the old white man with the long beard who is depicted in literature and artwork. So this idea of the universe is actually an all-encompassing term for everything God has created. And Emerson's argument is that it's all holy, which is actually a very inherently Christian perspective. Emerson goes so far as to say that in all conversations between two persons, tacit reference is made as to a third party, to a common nature. That third party or common nature is not social, it is God. So he believes that God is not only in the human person, but in their dealings with each other and their conversations. And he goes on to discuss how we can recognize God, or in this sense, I believe he uses truth synonymously with God. He says, "The soul is the perceiver and revealer of truth. We know truth when we see it. Let skeptic and scoffer say what they choose. Foolish people ask you when you have spoken what they do not wish to hear, how do you know it is truth and not an error of your own? We know truth when we see it, from opinion, as we know we are awake when we are awake." It is a grand sentence of Emanuel Swedenborg, which would alone indicate the greatness of man's perception. It is no proof of a man's understanding to be able to affirm whatever he pleases, but to be able to discern that what is true, and that what is false. That is the mark and character of intelligence. We are wiser than we know. I think, sadly, we are all kind of looking for whatever, quote, truth affirms the worldview that feels safest to us. And we don't let ourselves venture far beyond that. But there is no God in that. There is fear in that. When we are unwilling to look at ideas and beliefs honestly through the lens of scrutiny, we become enslaved to everything external. We've essentially shut down what is internal, whatever questions, doubts, or feelings may arise from within, because we've submitted to some outside authority that makes us feel guilty for asking too many questions. But that's not the way faith should work, and it's not how I think God works. God has to be bigger than the boxes we put him in. I've said that so many times over the last few years, both out loud and to myself. And I have to believe he can handle our doubts. He can work with our own interpretations and the ways we sense him most in our lives. We have, established frameworks and prayers and liturgies that should be designed to help us feel closer to him. But ironically, I think we do a lot of those things just out of obligation, not really feeling them at heart level at all. And I think the closest we can actually be to God is when we honor our own inner promptings and motivations. They are not an accident. They are a manifestation of truth. And there are so many other golden nuggets in this essay. I could honestly go on and on, but I'll just bring up a few more. One thing as a Catholic that's recently bothered me a lot is this idea of hell, and more specifically, the idea of God sentencing anyone to hell. It's an idea I can't really wrap my mind around if God is truly all merciful and all loving, because sentencing someone to the worst fate we can imagine for them isn't even something we're inclined to do with our own worst enemies, and we're infallible people, right? But Emerson kind of tackles this in this essay, and he writes, "The intercourse of society is one wide judicial investigation of character. In full court, men offer themselves to be judged. Against their will, they exhibit those decisive trifles by which character is read. But who judges, and what? Not our understanding. No, the wisdom of the wise man consists herein, that he does not judge them. He lets them judge themselves, and merely reads and records their own verdict." I thought this was so incredibly powerful. I'm honestly not even sure if I'm reading it the way Emerson intended it to be read, but I imagine God's judgment works something like this. For me, the more abstract something is, the easier it can be applied to a divine, omnipotent being, because I think of God as far more complex than we can ever effectively explain or understand. But it makes a lot of sense, right? If we are hard on ourselves and think the worst of ourselves and expect perfection of ourselves and tear ourselves down ruthlessly over and over again, and God lives in us, which most of us are taught in many religious traditions, we're essentially profaning God. And so we're doling out our own judgment. Probably not a perfect interpretation, but that's how I read this passage, and for me it just really seemed to make sense. Finally, at the heart of this essay is its final passages, where Emerson writes, "God will not make himself manifest to cowards. He must greatly listen to himself, withdrawing himself from all the accents of other men's devotion. Even their prayers are hurtful to him, until he have made his own. Our religion vulgarly stands on numbers of believers, but he that finds God a sweet, enveloping thought to him never counts his company. It makes no difference whether the appeal is to numbers or to one. The faith that stands on authority is not faith. The reliance on authority measures the decline of religion, the withdrawal of the soul. Great is the soul and plain. It is no flatterer, it is no follower. It never appeals from itself. It believes in itself. The soul gives itself alone, original and pure, to the lonely original and pure. It is not wise, but it sees through all things. It is not called religious, but it is innocent. Thus revering the soul and learning, as the ancients said, that its beauty is immense, man will come to see that all history is sacred, that the universe is represented in an atom, in a moment of time. He will weave no longer a spotted life of shreds and patches, but he will live with a divine unity. He will cease from what is base and frivolous in his life and be content with all places and with any service he can render. He will calmly front the morrow in his negligence of that trust which he carries God with it, and so hath already the whole future in the bottom of his heart." I really don't have any words, so I'll just let Emerson speak for himself here. I realize I've read a lot of excerpts from his work in this episode, but when I say this man was something special, you should know just how special. If you needed a reason to read him, here it all is. And this episode is a very, very small taste of the gems that I've found throughout his essays. I'll conclude tonight by just saying that there is so much more to who we are than what we've been told, than the mentalities and ideologies and biases we've been raised with or absorbed over the years. Emerson reminds us that the divine is continually unfolding within us, and that's true whether you're spiritual or not. There is something so sacred that lives within each of us, that lives within every creature, that lives within the soul of the earth and the essence of the universe, because we are alive, and because we can love and are capable of loving, because we can think and discern and act and refine our character and change our minds and do the right thing after making the wrong decision and choose courage in the face of fear. All of these things are what give us souls. We are each one very small particle of the divine, and I believe that's why prayer works. Not necessarily because there's a deity who decides which of our prayers to answer and which to ignore, but because we're all connected, and there's power in that. Where the soul lives, God lives. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me around the fire this evening, and I wish you many long, peace-filled summer nights of reading and coming to a deeper understanding of who you are by the words that find you in literature. I'll see you around the hearth again very soon.